They thought a woman who couldn't speak couldn't possibly be dangerous, and that mistake nearly cost 12 trained killers their lives. Quinn Donovan was 27, drowning in her dying mother's hospital bills, and so quiet that most people forgot she was standing in the room at all. She'd lost her voice 4 years earlier on a night she never talked about, and now she answered every question with a small whiteboard and a steady, careful hand. When the Brennan estate hired her as a housemaid, nobody asked about her past, because nobody believed a mute, timid girl in a second-hand coat had a past worth hiding. Holt Brennan didn't either. At 37, he ran the darkest corners of Baltimore's waterfront with a cold, surgical cruelty that had buried every rival who'd ever tested him, and he'd hired her for one chilling reason alone. A woman who couldn't talk could never sell his secrets. He didn't know that the silent girl polishing his floors had once been one of the deadliest tactical marksmen the city had ever trained. He didn't know she noticed everything. The cousin who whispered in empty hallways, the security camera tilted just 3 degrees too far, the unfamiliar sedan that appeared twice in 2 different parts of town. Everyone in that mansion talked freely in front of her, certain she was nothing more than a convenient silence, and that arrogance was about to become the most expensive mistake of their lives. Because not long after, on a rain-soaked pier with headlights closing in from every direction and a dozen hired guns stepping out of the dark, the man who trusted no one would find himself protected by the one person he'd treated as invisible. And when a bullet meant for his heart came screaming through the night, the woman who hadn't spoken a single word in 4 years would throw her own body in its path and finally make a sound. So, before we go any further, if a story about the underestimated, the overlooked, and the quiet ones who turn out to be the strongest in the room is the kind of story you love, do us a favor and hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that being silent has never once meant being weak. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss what happens next. Now let's go back to the very beginning, before the gunfire ever shattered the night, to the morning a broke, voiceless young woman walked through the gates of the most dangerous man in Baltimore. That morning, a fine drizzle fell over the old neighborhood on the east side of Baltimore, where rows of faded red brick houses crowded close together along a narrow street that always seemed to carry the damp, mildewed smell rising from the basements below. Quinn Donovan woke before the alarm had a chance to ring, the way she had every day for the past several years, and lay still for a while on the bed, pushed against a wall stained with spreading watermarks, listening to the old pipes groan inside the walls. Her rented room was so small that if she stood in the middle of it, she could touch both walls with her hands. The wooden floor creaked and felt icy beneath her bare feet, and every morning she had to place a basin beneath the leaking spot in the ceiling, so the water wouldn't spread across the only rug she owned. On the folding table beside the window lay a thick stack of bills, every one of them stamped in red by the hospital, every one of them carrying the same name, her mother's, the woman who was lying in a cancer treatment ward almost an hour away by bus. Each time Quinn looked at the final number printed in bold at the bottom of the page, she felt her chest tighten as though someone were pulling an invisible cord around her heart. She made herself a cup of watery instant coffee, drank it quickly by the window while looking down at the rain-soaked street, then opened the drawer and took out a small whiteboard no bigger than her hand, along with a marker that was nearly out of ink. She wiped away the old words and slipped it into her frayed canvas bag, with the job application documents she had pressed neatly flat inside a plastic folder. The coat she wore had been bought second-hand from a charity shop. The shoulders were a little too wide, and the color had faded, but she had washed and ironed it so carefully that it looked almost new, because she understood that for people like her, a tidy appearance was sometimes the only thing still within their control. She stepped out to the bus stop beneath the misting rain, stood quietly among the crowd of early shift workers, and when the bus pulled up, she climbed aboard, found a seat by the window, placed her bag on her lap, and watched the city drift past behind the glass blurred with water. The bus passed through neighborhoods that grew more polished with every mile, from cramped rows of houses to wide, tree-lined roads, until at last it stopped near the North Harbor district, where mansions sat behind towering iron fences, and lawns were trimmed so smooth they looked like tabletops. Quinn got off and walked a little farther along a long stone wall that seemed almost endless, until she stood before the great, glossy, black wrought iron gate of the Brennan family mansion, a structure so imposing that it made her draw her shoulders in by instinct. A man in a dark suit stepped out of the guardhouse and looked her up and down with the quick, sorting glance she had known for a long time, the kind of look that had already decided she wasn't worth much attention. She said nothing. She only took the referral card from the employment agency and the interview appointment paper from her bag and handed them to him with both hands. The gate guard frowned and asked for her name, and when she didn't answer aloud but instead took out the whiteboard, quickly wrote Quinn Donovan, applying for the housemaid position, appointment at 9 o'clock, then turned the board toward him. A hard-to-read expression flickered across the man's face, half surprise and half irritation, as though her silence were an inconvenience that had to be dealt with. He said something into his radio, waited for a while, then reluctantly opened the side gate and jerked his head to signal that she should go in by the servants' entrance, a narrow gravel path that curved around toward the back of the main house. Quinn lowered her head in thanks with a small nod and stepped through the gate. Her old shoes crunched over the wet gravel, and when she lifted her eyes to the massive mansion casting its shadow over her, she drew in a deep breath, forced her slightly trembling hands to hold tight to the straps of her bag, and told herself that no matter how people looked at her, today she needed only one thing: this job, because behind every one of those red-stamped bills was one more day of life for the only person left in the world she called family. An older woman with silver hair pinned neatly into a bun and a perfectly upright walk came to meet her at the back door, introducing herself as Maid, the housekeeper of the mansion. Her voice was dry but not hostile, and her sharp eyes swept once over Quinn's appearance before stopping on the whiteboard she was holding in her hand. When Quinn wrote a greeting on the board and turned it toward her, Maeve only raised one eyebrow slightly, nodded once as though she had already been told about Quinn's silence, then turned and led her through the servants' corridor, walking as she went over the rules of the house and the flat, even voice of someone who had repeated the same things hundreds of times. Quinn followed behind her, her eyes lowered with proper restraint, but her mind was quietly taking in every detail of the space around her, with a habit that had long since settled deep into her flesh and blood: the layout of the exits, the position of the locks, the thickness of the doors, and above all, the security cameras mounted here and there along the ceiling. When the two of them crossed a bend that opened onto a stone-paved courtyard, her gaze accidentally slid up to the camera fixed in the corner of the wall above the rear door, and something made her halt for half a step, because that camera had been turned slightly away from the direction it should have been sweeping, creating a blind spot just wide enough to hide the entire set of steps and the door below. She lowered her eyes to that heavy wooden door, and at once she noticed the second thing. The edge of the lock and the wooden frame around it bore fresh scratches that were still pale in color, small but unmistakable marks left by something hard that had been slipped in and levered upward, not the trace of time, but the trace of a human hand. Quinn stopped completely, and Maeve had taken several more steps before she realized it. She turned back to look at Quinn with irritation and asked what was wrong, but Quinn didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer to the door, bent down to study the lock carefully for another moment, then took out her marker and wrote on the board, "The camera at this corner has been turned off its proper angle and has created a blind spot, and the rear door lock has fresh pry marks, so someone should check it again." Maeve read the words and briefly went still, then frowned as though she couldn't believe a girl who had arrived only minutes ago would dare comment on the security system of a house like this. But the quiet certainty on Quinn's face kept her from dismissing it outright, and after a moment of hesitation, she took out her radio and called someone over to inspect it. Only a few minutes later, a thin, tall man in a dark jacket stepped out from inside the house, introduced himself curtly as Sol Reyes, the one in charge of security, and when Maeve pointed to Quinn's board and then to the camera, his eyes passed over the unfamiliar girl with a coldness that was almost indifference before he reluctantly looked up at the corner of the wall. He stood in silence for quite a while, studying the camera that had been turned out of position and the pry marks on the doorframe. His face revealed no emotion at all, no surprise, no admiration, only a guarded and unreadable flicker deep in his eyes. And then he said shortly that he would have someone adjust it, his voice so even it seemed he was deliberately trying to lessen the importance of the discovery. It was at that very moment that a deep, cold voice sounded from the inner hallway, asking why so many people were gathered at the rear door. And when everyone turned back, a man stepped out of the shadowed passageway. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit cut with flawless precision, yet without a single piece of showy jewelry. His angular face carried the worn exhaustion of long, sleepless nights, and his eyes were so sharp that Quinn had the feeling one glance from him would be enough to read through the entire room. Maeve lowered her head slightly and called him young Mr. Brennan, and Quinn understood at once that this was the owner of the mansion. the man whom both the gate guard and the housekeeper had mentioned with a mixture of respect and fear. Holt Brennan let his eyes sweep over the situation, stopped at the whiteboard in Quinn's hand, then asked her directly what she had just written. When she silently turned the board toward him, he read those 2 lines slowly, his eyes narrowing, then lifted his gaze to look at her with an attention completely different from the sorting looks she had received since morning, a look that, for the first time that day, was truly seeing her. Holt Brennan stood silent for a moment, his cold, sharp eyes never leaving Quinn's face, then signaled for Maeve and Sol to step away so he could speak privately with the strange girl right there in the courtyard. When only the 2 of them remained, he asked which employment agency she had come from, how long she had been writing to communicate before she came here, and why a person applying for a housemaid position would notice a camera turned out of place when his entire professional security team had failed to see it all this time. Quinn didn't rush to answer. She wiped the board clean and wrote each line with calm precision, saying that she was simply used to seeing the things other people usually overlooked, that the places no one paid attention to were often the most dangerous ones, and that she had been living by caution for a very long time. Holt read those lines, and the corner of his mouth lifted in something almost like a smile, though there was no warmth in it at all. He said most of the people who sat in the chair where she was standing tried to impress him with polished words, with promises of loyalty, and that he had grown deeply tired of mouths that talked too much. He walked slowly around her once, like a man weighing the value of an object, then stopped and stated plainly the thing that interested him, that in this entire house, the greatest problem had never been the thieves outside, but the tongues inside, the servants who heard what they shouldn't hear and then carried it away to sell to the highest bidder, and that someone who couldn't speak also couldn't betray him with words, couldn't whisper his secrets into anyone's ear. He said it with such calm cruelty that Quinn understood at once that in his eyes, her silence wasn't a pitiable disadvantage, but an asset, a guarantee, and she stood there, swallowing the feeling of being looked at more like a tool than a human being, because she was far too used to having her worth measured by others in whatever way benefited them. Holt called Maeve back and said curtly that he had decided to hire her, then told the woman to handle the paperwork. He turned to Quinn and added that her wages would be 3 times the usual rate, and in exchange, she had to obey the rules of the house absolutely. She was never to take anything beyond the gate, never to tell anyone outside about anything she saw inside, and if one day he discovered she wasn't what she appeared to be now, he would deal with it himself, in his own way. Quinn listened to those cold threats, and instead of feeling afraid, she thought only of the bold number printed at the bottom of the red-stamped bills, thought of her mother's pale face on the hospital bed, thought of how many more months that 3 times higher salary could keep that woman in treatment, and she nodded her acceptance without the slightest hesitation, writing a brief line on the board that she agreed to all the terms. Maeve led her into a small room at the back to sign the contract, a thick stack of papers packed with harsh binding conditions, and Quinn read through every line carefully before putting her name down. After that, Maeve took her up to the servants' quarters in the attic, a row of small, plain rooms that were still much cleaner and warmer than the leaking rented room she had left behind that morning. When Maeve left her alone in the room assigned to her, reminding her that work would begin at 6 o'clock the next morning, Quinn sat down on the edge of the bed, placed the whiteboard on her lap, and looked out through the small window facing the distant harbor. A feeling she couldn't quite name rose inside her, tangled and uneasy. Relief, because she had finally gotten this lifeline of a job, and a vague disquiet before the coldness radiating from the man who had just hired her, a man she sensed was hiding. Behind all that weariness and cruelty, darker things than a camera turned out of place could ever reveal. The first days inside the Brennan mansion passed according to a strict rhythm that Quinn quickly learned by heart. She woke before 6 o'clock, cleaned the rooms in the assigned order, prepared the breakfast table, then quietly withdrew into the background, so the life of the house could continue as though she were not present at all. And she did every one of those tasks with a meticulous care that even Maeve, demanding as she was, couldn't find anything to criticize. But while her hands wiped each window frame and arranged each place setting, her mind was silently drawing a map of the entire house in a way no one would ever have suspected. She memorized the position of every entrance and exit, every service staircase, every hidden corner where the light didn't reach. She memorized the hours when each person came and went, the habits of every guard, who usually smoked by the back door, and at what time, which man on the night shift tended to grow careless near dawn, which car was parked in which place in the underground garage. All of it was arranged in her mind, with the orderly precision of someone carefully studying an unfamiliar place before truly belonging to it. Quinn's greatest advantage, ironically, was also the thing that had wounded her most deeply, because since she couldn't speak, almost everyone in the house automatically treated her like a moving piece of furniture, a harmless presence so unimportant that no one thought to lower their voice or stop a conversation when she was nearby. And so she often became an unwilling witness to things she shouldn't have heard. The guards talked in front of her about night shipments at the harbor, about sums of money being moved through names she had never heard before, and sometimes they even laughed and pointed in her direction, throwing out mocking remarks about how lucky it was that this girl was mute, so even if she heard anything, she couldn't tell anyone. Then they would go right on, talking as though she were nothing more than a wall that knew how to breathe. Quinn swallowed all those words down, her face still carrying its usual calm expression, but each time she was treated like something without ears to hear and without a heart to hurt. Something inside her quietly tightened, not from anger, but from an old, weary sadness that the worth of a human being in other people's eyes could be reduced to whether that person could make a sound. There were only a few small exceptions in the midst of that coldness. Maeve, though dry in manner, was always fair. Now and then she set aside a warm meal for Quinn and spoke to her in brief sentences that held no contempt, treating her as a proper worker rather than an object, and that small measure of respect sometimes moved Quinn more than anything else could have. She noticed that in this house, everyone wore a mask of their own. The guards were loud and crude. Maeve was restrained and tired. And Sol Reyes, the head of security, always kept an unreadable calm about him, appearing in places and at times that seemed slightly unusual to Quinn for someone whose duty was only to oversee security. But she didn't rush to any conclusion. She simply recorded it in silence, the way she recorded everything else. As for Holt Brennan, she barely saw him during those first days. He came and went unpredictably, usually returning very late with a face even more exhausted than it had been the first time she saw him, and whenever he passed her in the hallway, he only glanced at her for a moment before walking on without a word. But that look was nothing like the indifferent glances she received from the others. It was the look of a man quietly observing, weighing, as though he still had not fully decided what kind of person she was. And Quinn, who had long been used to being looked at in every possible way, felt for the first time that there was one pair of eyes in this house truly trying to see through her silence, instead of merely sliding past it. One afternoon, while Holt was away from the house handling business at the harbor, Quinn was assigned to clean the row of offices in the East Wing, and as she was quietly dusting the bookshelves in the reading room beside it, she heard voices drifting out from the small meeting room on the other side of the wall, where the door had been left only partly closed instead of shut all the way. She recognized one of those voices as belonging to Garrett Brennan, Holt's older cousin, a man in his early 40s with a social smile that always seemed fixed to his mouth, though his eyes were always shifting around with restless unease. A man Quinn had noticed came and went from the mansion far more often during the exact stretches of time when Holt wasn't there. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but her ears, long trained to sift through sound, automatically caught the fragments of conversation slipping through the crack in the door, words spoken in unusually lowered voices, mentioning a deadline drawing near, the need to settle everything before it all came apart, and a large sum of money spoken in the low, hurried tone of someone under heavy pressure. Quinn kept her hand moving across the bookshelf so she wouldn't make any suspicious sound, but her eyes slid toward the narrow opening of the door, and she saw Garrett hand the person across from him a thick brown envelope with no name written on it. The kind of envelope that, in her experience, was usually used for cash or documents no one wanted passing through any official record. She couldn't see the face of the person receiving it because of the hidden angle of the door. She caught only a glimpse of a hand and part of the shoulder of a dark jacket before the conversation ended abruptly, and she heard a chair scrape, forcing her to move quickly into the next room so she wouldn't be caught. That afternoon, when she carried a tea tray out to the front courtyard, as Maeve had instructed, Quinn noticed another detail that stirred a faint uneasiness inside her. A gray sedan parked silently across the street from the main gate, far enough away to stay out of the direct sweep of the gate camera, with someone sitting behind the wheel in a strangely motionless posture, not looking at a phone, not leaving, simply sitting there and watching. The car had a small spider-web-shaped crack in the corner of the passenger side windshield, a mark of recognition that she quietly fixed in her mind, without understanding why her instincts were telling her it mattered. When she turned back inside, She found Sol Reyes standing at the end of the hallway, leading toward the meeting room Garrett had just left. He wasn't doing anything at all, only standing there with both hands in his pockets, his eyes resting on Quinn for longer than usual as she passed. A look that wasn't hostile but wasn't friendly either, the kind of look belonging to a man silently measuring where she had just been and whether she had seen anything. Quinn lowered her head and kept walking as she always did, her face completely blank. But in her mind, the scattered pieces were beginning to arrange themselves beside one another in a way that could no longer be ignored. A secret meeting while the master of the house was away. An unnamed envelope of money passed from hand to hand, a strange car patiently keeping watch outside, and the oddly well-timed presence of the head of security in places where he shouldn't have needed to be. She didn't know what kind of picture those things would form when put together, and she was wise enough to understand that a silent servant, who had been there less than 2 weeks, had neither the standing nor the proof to say anything at all, so she did the only thing she could do in that moment. She stayed silent, kept watching, and quietly carved every detail into memory, waiting until those broken pieces became something even the people who still treated her as invisible would no longer be able to deny. Late one night, after she had spent enough time adjusting to the rhythm of the house, when the whole house had sunk into silence, and Quinn couldn't sleep because the pieces in her mind kept threatening to arrange themselves together, she quietly went downstairs to clean the library. A broad room with bookshelves rising all the way to the ceiling, and warm yellow light falling across the spines of old leather-bound books, and she began her work in a stillness that made it seem as though she were entirely alone. She had no idea that Holt was there too, sitting motionless in an armchair hidden behind a row of shelves, an untouched glass of whiskey resting on the armrest, his eyes fixed on empty space, as though he were looking at something very far away. When he shifted slightly and made the chair creak, Quinn startled and turned back, quickly lowering her head as if to withdraw, because she thought she had disturbed the master of the house, but he lifted a hand to signal for her to stay, his deep voice hoarse with exhaustion as he said she should keep doing her work, that he couldn't sleep either. Quinn continued in silence, but she could feel that the cold man was different tonight, that his usual sharp outer shell seemed to have grown thinner beneath the weight of something, and after a long while, he suddenly spoke and asked her whether she knew what it felt like to live in a house where you couldn't trust anyone. Quinn paused, hesitated for a moment, then set the cloth down, took out the small board she always carried with her, and wrote that she understood what it felt like to have to carry everything alone by herself, then turned the board toward him beneath the yellow light. Holt read the words, remained silent for a long time, then let out a soundless little laugh and said that maybe it was precisely because she couldn't speak that he found it easier to talk to her, because she couldn't interrupt, couldn't judge, couldn't pretend to sympathize with the hollow phrases people were used to saying, and that it had been a very long time since he had sat in the same room with anyone without having to guard every word. He took a sip of whiskey, his gaze drifting back into empty space, then began to tell her, in the flat voice of a man who had buried something so deep it no longer hurt in the ordinary way, that his father had once sat in the very chair where he was sitting now, had built everything Holt now held in his hands, and then one night had been betrayed by the person he trusted most in the house, someone who shared the same blood, a person who sold him out in exchange for power and money, and his father had died right inside this house, killed by the hand of the very person who should have protected him. Quinn listened to every word, and she didn't write empty words of comfort, didn't show him pity. She only wrote one simple line, that betrayal by someone within the family was a wound that never fully healed, because it taught a person how to stop trusting, and that was the greatest loss of all. Holt read that line for a very long time, then lifted his eyes to look at her with an expression Quinn had never seen in him before, no longer cold and searching, but stripped down to the naked weariness of a lonely human being. And he said softly that she was the first person in many years who had understood that without needing him to explain it. In that moment, inside the silent library beneath the yellow light, two people from completely different worlds, a powerful kingpin, imprisoned inside his own suspicion, and a silent housemaid, carrying wounds she had never told anyone about, suddenly recognized in each other a strange harmony neither of them named, a quiet understanding taking root in silence. Quinn was the one who left first. She gave him a small bow of farewell and stepped out of the library with her heart beating faster than usual, reminding herself that between her and that man there was a boundary that shouldn't be crossed, that she had come here because of the red-stamped bills and not for anything else. But when she lay down in her small attic room that night, She still couldn't drive from her mind the image of his lonely eyes beneath the yellow light. And for the first time in a very long while, the familiar silence surrounding her felt just a little less empty. After that night in the library, Holt began paying attention to Quinn in a different way. It was no longer the fleeting, probing glance of the first few days, but a focused and persistent observation, because the quiet understanding she had shown that night stirred in him a question his suspicious nature couldn't ignore. How could a silent housemaid see through the loneliness of another human being through only a few written lines? And how could someone newly arrived notice a security flaw that his entire professional team had missed? He called Sol Reyes up to his office and quietly assigned him the task of checking the girl's entire background again. Every place she had ever worked, every address where she had ever lived, everything that could be dug up about the past of a woman named Quinn Donovan. Sol accepted the order with his usual calm expression, but something unreadable flickered in the corner of his eyes, and Holt didn't notice it at the time. A few days later, Sol returned with a thin file and a displeased look, reporting that most of the information about her was ordinary. A woman who had done small jobs, no criminal record, no suspicious debts apart from the enormous hospital bills for her gravely ill mother. But there was a stretch of several years in her background that was completely blank. No employment records, no clear address, and when he tried to follow that trail, he ran into a sealed portion of her file that even his connections couldn't access. Holt picked up that thin file and turned through page after page, his eyes lingering for a long time on the suspicious gap in her past, and instead of feeling distrust the way he distrusted everyone, he felt his curiosity deepen, because a sealed past meant she had once done something important enough for the government to hide, not something shameful enough for her to hide by herself. He began noticing the small details in the way she moved through the house, the way she always sat with her back to the wall and her face toward the exit, the way her eyes could sweep through an unfamiliar room in a split second and grasp the whole layout, the way her hands never trembled when holding something heavy or when standing near the large guards. None of those things belonged to an ordinary housemaid. And the more he watched, the more he believed that this silent woman was carrying a secret far greater than her worn and desperate appearance suggested. As for Quinn, she quickly realized she was being watched more carefully. She could feel Holt's gaze lingering on her longer whenever he passed by, noticed Sol Reyes appearing near the areas where she worked more often than before, and one evening, while cleaning Holt's office, she accidentally saw a file bearing her own name, lying carelessly on the desk, making her heart tighten because she understood that the past she had buried for so long was slowly being unearthed. Inside that file as well, a note clipped between the pages caught her eye, a handwritten line mentioning a name she never expected to see in this place, the name Bishop Vance written beside a question mark, and the moment she read that name, a familiar chill ran down Quinn's spine. It was a name she had thought she had left behind, along with everything she never wanted to remember, a name she hurriedly pretended not to have seen, as she placed the file back exactly where it had been, and left the room with both hands clenched tight, her heart rising with an uneasy instinct that the world she had spent all those years running from perhaps had never truly let her go the way she had believed. The name Bishop Vance remained like a smoldering ember inside Quinn through the days that followed, making her pay even closer attention to every unusual sign around her, and it was that very vigilance that helped her catch the next piece of the puzzle one morning. While she was cleaning the glass doors near the front courtyard, she saw the familiar gray sedan again, still with the spiderweb-shaped crack in the corner of the passenger side windshield, this time parked in a different spot, some distance from the mansion, but still holding that same patient posture of surveillance, and the fact that the car had appeared a second time in a different location erased any possibility that it was merely a coincidence, confirming in her mind that someone was watching this house in a deliberate and systematic way. That same afternoon, when she was assigned to carry documents up to the East Wing, Quinn passed by Garrett's office just as the door stood slightly open and heard his voice speaking on the phone to someone in a tense, tightly restrained tone, mentioning that the paperwork was almost finished, that as long as they could get the agreement signed before the end of the month, all the debts would be wiped clean, and that the other side only needed to be patient for a few more days, because the hardest part was about to be resolved. Those words, when placed beside the envelope of money and the secret meeting from before, made the picture in Quinn's mind much clearer. She didn't stop for long, but kept walking like an indifferent servant. Yet that evening, when she was given the task of cleaning the small meeting room in the East Wing after everyone had left, She happened to see a stack of documents someone had carelessly forgotten on the table. When her eyes skimmed the first page, her heart began to beat faster because she realized it was a contract transferring control of part of the North Harbor District. The area she knew was the core asset that formed the Brennan family's power, drafted to pass into the hands of an intermediary legal entity under vague terms that, even at a glance, she understood would drain power from Holt's hands without him knowing it at all. Quinn stood still for a moment, weighing very quickly whether to ignore it and keep herself safe, or to do what the old instinct inside her was urging her to do. Then she decided. She took the old phone from the pocket of her apron, a battered device. Yet its high-end camera was the one piece of surveillance gear she had kept from her tactical days. She listened once more for any movement in the hallway to make sure no one was there, and swiftly, decisively photographed every important page of the contract, making certain to capture the names, the numbers, and especially the name of the intermediary legal entity meant to receive the transfer, before placing the stack of documents back exactly as it had been, as though she had never touched it. She did all of it with a calm and precision, so cold it was almost frightening. Her hands didn't tremble. Her breathing stayed even. It was a kind of practiced competence, whose origin she herself didn't want to think about. Then she left the meeting room, carrying in her old phone the first pieces of evidence that could prove there was a plot, quietly bleeding away the empire of the man who had hired her. That night, sitting alone in her small attic room, Quinn reviewed each photograph she had taken beneath the dim glow of the screen, fitting them together with everything she had silently recorded since her very first day: the secret meeting, the nameless envelope, the phone call about the debts, the watching sedan, the transfer contract, and the chilling name Bishop Vance clipped inside the file bearing her own name. But even though the picture had become much clearer, she forced herself to remain cautious and not rush to pin everything on one person, because bitter experience had taught her that in plots like this, the person who showed his face most openly wasn't necessarily the most dangerous one, and that the more pieces she held in her hands, the more careful she had to be about whom to trust and when to reveal what she knew. Carrying within her the evidence she had just gathered, Quinn was tormented for an entire day between the fear of exposing herself and the conscience urging her to give a warning, until she couldn't bear it any longer and decided she had to speak out about what she knew, even if it could only be through the one way available to her, through written words. She chose a moment when Holt was away from the house, and Garrett, along with several guards, was gathered in the great sitting room. She carefully wrote on a sheet of paper a warning that someone was preparing to transfer control of the North Harbor District in secret, and that the house was being watched from the outside. Then she drew in a deep breath, stepped into the sitting room, and handed the paper to the person closest to her, hoping that whoever it was would at least read it and pass the message to the right person. But what she received in return wasn't attention. It was snickering. One guard snatched the paper from her hand, skimmed it, then read it aloud in a mocking imitation, making the whole room erupt into laughter, and Garrett, after glancing over the contents, they went pale for one brief second, before quickly covering it with a strained smile and a loose remark that this mute little maid must have watched too many detective movies and started imagining all kinds of things. Then he took the paper, tore it in half right in front of her, then tore it again, letting the scraps drift down across the floor as though he were throwing away something worthless. Another guard said that if she was mute, what could she possibly know about grown men's business, acting like she had warnings to give? Someone else waved her away as if chasing off a bothersome animal, and Quinn stood there in the middle of the room, beneath those contemptuous stares and coarse bursts of laughter, feeling a hot humiliation rise all the way into her throat, not because of their vicious words, but because of the bitter truth that in the eyes of these people, her voice carried no weight, simply because it couldn't come out as sound. That what she knew, no matter how important it might be, could still be thrown aside only because the person who brought it to them was someone they believed wasn't worth listening to. She didn't cry. She didn't react. She only quietly bent down and picked up each torn scrap of her paper from the floor, while the laughter still hadn't died, gathering them into her palm with a strangely calm expression, then stood and turned away from the room with her back straight and her steps unhurried, carrying with her the hurt she had grown far too used to bearing alone. She didn't know that Holt had returned earlier than expected and was standing silently in the doorway connecting to the hall, that he had witnessed the entire scene from beginning to end, had heard the mockery, had seen the paper torn apart, and the way she quietly gathered each piece back up, and something in his face, usually as cold as stone, had shifted faintly. He said nothing as she passed him, only leaned slightly aside to let her through. But after she was gone, he stepped into the room where the laughter had just begun to thin out, quietly bent down, and picked up a scrap of paper left under a chair, one Quinn hadn't managed to collect. He smoothed it flat in his palm and read the scattered words still visible on it. And when he lifted his head, his eyes swept over every face in the room that still carried traces of laughter with a new coldness. Not absolute trust in the warning of a woman he still didn't fully understand, but the beginning of a deep suspicion that perhaps the only person in this house telling the truth was the only one who couldn't speak it aloud. Only a few days later, late one afternoon when the Baltimore sky had turned gray with the promise of heavy rain, Garrett came to Holt with an urgency that had been carefully staged, saying that the partners on the other side wanted an immediate meeting to negotiate an important agreement at the old warehouse out by the North Harbor that very night, that this was a rare chance to settle the tensions that had been smoldering for so long, and that they required Holt to come in person, with only a small detail, without bringing too many men, in order to show goodwill. Holt listened with a face that revealed nothing, but inside him, the scrap of paper he had picked up under the chair days earlier, and Quinn's torn warning echoed again. And though he wasn't completely certain of anything yet, the survival instinct sharpened through years in the underworld told him that something was very wrong with this unusual haste. Quinn, when she overheard the guards preparing vehicles for the evening trip and mentioning the warehouse location at the North Harbor, immediately felt her blood run cold, because all the pieces she had gathered for so long suddenly locked together into one single picture, clear enough to chill her to the bone. The secret meeting, the envelope of money, the harbor contract, the watching car, all of it was leading to the very trap being laid beneath the cover of a negotiation. She knew she couldn't simply stand by and watch, and she also knew that if she tried to warn them with another piece of paper, the result would be no different from before, so she did the only thing that could truly change the situation. She quietly went down to the underground garage before the time of departure, where the assigned driver was preparing the car, and with her familiar calm and her whiteboard, she signaled that Maeve needed to see him urgently inside the house, enough to make him leave for a few minutes. When Holt stepped down into the garage in his dark coat, he stopped for a moment when he saw that the person sitting behind the wheel wasn't his usual driver, but Quinn, the silent housemaid, both hands steady on the steering wheel, her calm eyes watching him through the rearview mirror. And when he narrowed his eyes as if to ask a question, she simply lifted the board where she had already written that tonight she should drive, that he would be safer, and that he needed to trust her this once. Holt looked at her for a long time beneath the cold yellow lights of the underground garage, and in that decisive moment, between the suspicion that had become his instinct and something in the steady gaze of this woman, he chose the thing even he hadn't expected. He opened the rear door and got into the car, saying shortly that he hoped she knew what she was doing. The car rolled out of the mansion as the first drops of rain began to fall, and the closer they came to the North Harbor, the emptier and darker the surroundings became. Rows of abandoned warehouses rose like black silhouettes against the sky. The wet road glimmered with reflected patches of thin yellow light, and Quinn kept the wheel steady, while her eyes never stopped sweeping over every shadowed corner, every alley between the warehouses, recording each strange detail with the absolute focus of someone entering dangerous ground. Just as the car turned onto the narrow road leading to the appointed warehouse, the rain suddenly came down harder, and then from the darkness on both sides, pairs of blinding headlights flared to life all at once, tearing through the night and sealing off both the way ahead and the way behind. One car shot out to block the front, another rolled in to lock them in from the rear, trapping their vehicle in the middle of an ambush that had clearly been waiting for them all along. From the back seat, Holt spat out a curse, called Quinn's name, and demanded to know what was happening, while armed shadows began stepping out from behind the circles of glaring light. And in that life-and-death moment, the woman who had not spoken a single word in all those weeks tightened her grip on the steering wheel, lowered herself down, and prepared to do the one thing none of the men closing the circle around them could possibly have expected. In the split second as the armed shadows closed in, Quinn didn't panic. She reacted with deadly calm, screaming the only command inside her own head. She had to get him out. She slammed her foot down on the gas and turned the wheel with decisive force, sending the car roaring straight into the narrow gap between the vehicle blocking the front and the warehouse wall, squeezing through so tightly that metal ground against metal and spat sparks, slipping out of the trap with a driving maneuver that only someone who had been properly trained could have performed on a slick road with visibility blurred by the curtain of rain. The first gunshots cracked through the air. Bullets punched into the body of the car and shattered the rear window. Holt threw himself down onto the floor by instinct, while Quinn kept one hand steady on the wheel and kept changing direction so the car wouldn't become a fixed target. Her head lowered, her eyes still locked on the road ahead, while also tracking the dark shapes, chasing them through the broken rearview mirror. The car broke through the first ring of the ambush, but the hired killers quickly jumped into their vehicles and gave chase. And when one of their cars surged forward to block the next turn, forcing Quinn to brake hard, she understood that they couldn't keep running forever. So she made a cold decision. She grabbed the handgun she had quietly prepared in the car ahead of time, lowered the window by a narrow crack, and with several shots of astonishing precision, she blew out the headlights of the pursuing car, then hit its front tire, sending it spinning sideways out of control and blocking the men behind it, opening a precious gap for her to continue getting Holt away. From the back seat, Holt looked up at the woman steering and firing with the skill of a true professional, and even in the midst of mortal danger, he couldn't help being stunned by the realization that the silent housemaid everyone in the mansion had looked down on was in fact someone entirely different from what he had believed. But the killers hired to come here were not ordinary men. They were many, and they were well organized, and when Quinn's car was forced to slow at a dead end, blocked by disorderly stacks of containers, another team had already managed to circle around and cut them off, forcing her to make the reckless choice to stop the car, pull Holt out, and escape on foot through the maze of cargo. The two of them moved along the darkness between the rows of containers, Quinn in front, shielding Holt behind her. Every step she took was calculated to keep him in the safest possible zone, and when a killer suddenly appeared from a blind corner and aimed his gun straight at them, everything seemed to slow down for one breathless, drawn-out instant. Quinn saw the barrel aimed directly at Holt. She saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger, and without 1 second of hesitation, she threw herself forward, shoved Holt down, and put her own body between him and the bullet. In that sharp explosion of sound, she felt a burning force tear through her shoulder and knock her off balance. Then a searing pain like something ripping her open spread through her whole body as she collapsed onto the cold, rain-soaked concrete, hot blood quickly spreading and soaking through the fabric over her shoulder blade. Holt caught her in his arms, his face stripped for the first time in his life of its usual iron calm, and in that very second, when pain and the fear of losing him forced everything she had buried for so many years to break open all at once, a hoarse sound suddenly tore out of the throat of the woman who had been silent for 4 long years, broken and ragged and uneven, yet unmistakably clear. It was his name, Holt, the first call she had spoken after all those years of silence, a call she paid for with her own blood. Holt went rigid, his eyes widening as he stared at her, unable to believe what he had just heard, and in the moment, he heard that shattered voice calling his name through the rain and gunfire. Something inside the ruthless, lonely man he had been for so long cracked and collapsed completely. He held her tight, forcing every bit of strength he had left into dragging her behind the cover of a container wall, his trembling hand pressing hard against her bleeding wound, his mouth calling her name again and again, telling her she had to hold on, that he wouldn't let her die in this dark place. Not the woman who had just saved his life, not the only person who had dared to stand between him and death when everyone else only wanted him gone. Hiding behind the wall of containers in the heavy rain, Holt quickly tore off his coat, crushed it into a tight bundle, and pressed it hard against the wound at Quinn's shoulder blade to stop the bleeding. With his other hand, he pulled out his phone and called an emergency contact he used only in the most desperate life and death situations, giving a firm order for a team of loyal guards to bring a car to pick them up at the western side entrance of the harbor district. His voice had gone hard, but for the first time in his life, his hands were trembling beyond his control. When the rescue vehicle burst through the blockade and managed to get them out of the harbor district, Holt held Quinn in his arms the entire way. He wouldn't let her lie down on the seat, but kept her propped against his chest, pressing his hand again and again over the wound and speaking to her in a voice none of his men had ever heard before, an urgent voice almost close to begging, telling her she had to stay awake, had to open her eyes and look at him, wasn't allowed to give in, while her blood kept seeping warm through his fingers in the cold of the rainy night. He didn't take her to the hospital, because he understood that a gunshot wound would bring the police and questions his world could never answer. Instead, he ordered them to drive straight to a doctor who had long served quietly for people who lived outside the law, a discreet clinic hidden behind what looked like an abandoned facility, where the old doctor silently took in the kinds of cases no official hospital would dare touch. When Quinn was placed on the operating table and the doctor began his work, Holt was ordered to wait outside, and the powerful man who was used to commanding an entire empire suddenly became completely helpless. He stood outside that closed door, his expensive suit smeared with her blood, his hands still stained red though he didn't bother to wipe them clean. And for the first time after all those years of burying every emotion beneath a shell of ice, he felt a raw fear that power and money couldn't drive away. He thought about everything she had done, about how she had quietly gathered every clue to warn him even after her paper had been torn apart and she had been mocked, about how she had willingly taken the driver's seat to place herself in the path of danger, and most of all, about the moment she had thrown herself in front of the bullet meant for him, a man she owed nothing to, an employer who had hired her for the cruel reason that she couldn't speak. The contrast between the way he had once treated her like a tool and the way she had just risked her life for him made his chest tighten until he could barely breathe. In that silent hallway, with only the sound of falling rain and the clatter of equipment drifting from the room inside, Holt Brennan, the man all of Baltimore feared, the man who had never allowed anyone to see him weak, quietly leaned back against the wall and slowly slid down until he was sitting on the floor, burying his head in his blood-stained hands. And for the first time since the night his father was murdered inside their own home, hot tears rolled down his face, a face that had always been cold as stone. No one saw it. No one knew. There was only him and the fear of losing the only person who had looked at him like a human being. He whispered to himself in the dark that if she survived, he would never let her be looked down on again, that he owed her a debt not even his entire fortune could repay. Many hours passed in suffocating waiting, and when the door finally opened, the old doctor stepped out looking exhausted but nodded in reassurance, saying the bullet had been removed, that she had lost a great deal of blood and would need a long time to recover fully, but she had passed through the worst of the danger and was alive. Holt sprang to his feet, and when he was allowed to enter the room where Quinn lay asleep on the sickbed, her face pale but her breathing steady again, he pulled a chair beside her, took her cold hand into his own, and sat there silently keeping watch over her for the rest of that long night, as though the moment he let go, the woman who had just fought her way back to life might vanish again. Quinn woke after nearly a full day lost in unconsciousness, and the first thing she saw when she opened her eyes was Holt still sitting there beside the bed, his eyes shadowed from a sleepless night, yet his gaze had softened in a way she had never seen before. When she moved slightly, he immediately leaned toward her and asked how she felt, whether the pain was very bad, his voice so gentle it seemed almost unfamiliar beside the cold man who had hired her in the beginning. In the days of recovery that followed, a quiet closeness slowly formed between them. Holt often sat beside her for hours, and one evening, when he gently asked about the name Bishop Vance, the name he knew she had accidentally seen in the file, as well as about the sound of his name that she had spoken amid the bullets after so many years of silence, Quinn looked at him for a long time. Then, for the first time since arriving in that house, she decided to open the door into the past she had kept locked away. She asked for a pad of paper and a pen, and through slow written lines, sometimes mixed with a few hand signs she was used to using, she began telling him about the person she had been before becoming a silent housemaid, about the years she had once served in a special tactical unit, trained to become a precision shooter, someone assigned missions where the margin for error was measured in split seconds, and where even one uneven breath could decide another person's life or death. Then she wrote about the night that changed her entire life, a hostage kidnapping where she had been sent in as long-range cover. And when her handwriting began to tremble, she told him that among the hostages being held by the criminal that night, there had been someone she never could have expected. Her own younger sister, the only person in the world she loved most, placed directly in her line of sight in a situation where she had to pull the trigger to save everyone. She wrote that in that fateful moment, when she recognized her sister's face right beside the kidnapper, the hand that had never trembled before faltered. Her heart hesitated for exactly a fraction of a second, and that brief, unforgivable hesitation had sent her shot off course, had kept her from saving her sister, and had forced her to watch the person she loved most collapse before her eyes while she looked on helplessly. Her handwriting blurred beneath the tears falling onto the page as she wrote that after that night, her voice disappeared, not because of any injury to her body, but because of a wound too deep in her soul, a silence that doctors named with medical terms, but to her was simply the way her heart punished itself. Because she felt that someone who had let her sister die because of one weak moment no longer deserved to raise her voice aloud. She wrote that she had left everything behind, buried her old self along with all her skills, and willingly lived a quiet, invisible life as a form of atonement, and that during the past 4 years, she had never allowed herself to hold a weapon again or place another person's life on her shoulders one more time, until that night at the harbor, when she saw the gun aimed at Holt. She wrote that in that moment, she hadn't allowed herself to hesitate again, that she had thrown herself in front of the bullet not only because she wanted to save him, but also because it was a chance to do what she had failed to do years ago, to atone for the weak instinct that had haunted her for 4 years, and that only when she was ready to trade her life to save another person did the voice she had locked away for so long finally break free again. Holt listened to the entire story in silence, and when she finished writing the final line, he gently took her ink-stained hand and held it tightly in his own, then told her in a choked voice that she wasn't someone who deserved punishment the way she had always believed, that a person who dared to use her own body to shield someone else from a bullet wasn't a coward, but the bravest person he had ever known, and that it was time for her to stop imprisoning herself in silence and begin forgiving herself. During the days of recovery, as her body slowly healed, Quinn's mind never rested. She kept turning over in her head the entire chain of events that had led to the trap at the harbor, and the more she thought, the more she realized that something didn't fit in the picture everyone was rushing to accept, because every accusation was being aimed at Garrett as the sole mastermind. Yet the instinct of someone once trained to analyze a scene told her that Garrett, with his obvious clumsiness and exposed nervousness, was only a pawn, not the true hand controlling the game. She began linking together every small detail she had quietly recorded from the earliest days, and the first piece that made her go cold was the camera turned aside to create a blind spot at the rear door on the day she had arrived, because now she realized something she had not had time to think through back then, that a camera didn't turn itself out of position. Someone had to adjust it, and the only person with full authority to interfere with the security system without drawing suspicion was the head of security, Sol Reyes, the man who had stood there watching her discovery with cold caution instead of gratitude. She remembered how Sol had always appeared in unusual places at unusual times, standing at the end of the hall after Garrett's secret meeting, lingering near the areas where she worked far more often than necessary, and she remembered the hand and the partial shoulder of a dark jacket she had glimpsed through the crack in the door when someone received the envelope of money from Garrett, a detail whose face she had not seen clearly then, but now, when placed beside the rest, the color of the jacket and the shape of the body matched Sol in a frightening way. She remembered that Sol himself had been the one assigned to investigate her background and report back to Holt, a position that allowed him to control what information was exposed and what information was hidden, and she suddenly understood that if there was a truly dangerous insider in this house, it had to be someone who controlled security, controlled information, and could disable every layer of protection from the inside, without anyone suspecting a thing, and every one of those conditions pointed toward one person alone. Quinn realized the trap at the harbor had been set with such precision that it couldn't have been the work of Garrett alone, a man drowning in debt and panic, because to lead Holt to the right place, at the right time, with the smallest possible number of men, and to neutralize every warning and every layer of security, it required a professional hand that understood the Brennan family's defenses from the inside out, and Garrett simply didn't have that ability. She understood that Garrett was only the pawn pushed out in front, the man with debts that made him easy to manipulate, the obvious one meant to become the scapegoat and absorb all suspicion when everything collapsed, while the true puppeteer remained calmly at Holt's side under the cover of a loyal protector, still able to reach him every day. And that was the deadly danger hanging over them all. The more Quinn pieced things together, the more clearly she saw that if Sol had already been willing to lure Holt into a death trap once, then the failure of the first trap would only force him to strike again, and the next time would be more direct and more ruthless, perhaps inside the very house everyone still believed was safest. That fear made it impossible for her to stay lying down any longer. She forced herself to sit up, despite the wound that had not yet healed, took the old phone that still held the photographs of the contract, along with everything she had recorded, and arranged them into a clear sequence that could prove what she had found, because she knew that this time she couldn't offer only a vague warning and let it be torn up and mocked again. She had to place in Holt's hands a chain of evidence strong enough that even a man as suspicious as he was couldn't deny it, and above all, she understood that she had to reach him and warn him about Sol before it was too late. before the insider, still roaming freely beneath the mask of loyalty, realized that his plot had been completely seen through by the silent woman he had always looked down on. As soon as Holt stepped into the room to visit her as he usually did, Quinn immediately handed him the phone along with the pages on which she had written out all of her deductions, patiently leading him through each link in the chain, from the camera that had been turned out of place on her first day, to the color of the jacket worn by the person who had received the envelope, to the fact that only Sol had enough control over security to disable every warning and lead him into the trap. Holt read it all with a face that grew darker by the moment, because although his suspicious nature made him want to argue against it, every piece of evidence she offered fit with the very things he himself had faintly felt uneasy about, but had not yet dared to name. He had not had time to make a decision when the thing Quinn feared most came upon them even faster than she had expected, because Sol Reyes, being a professional, had already sensed that the woman who survived the harbor trap was becoming a threat to him, and he decided to finish it inside the mansion itself, using his control over security to send most of the loyal guards off duty at the same time, and place his own men in key positions under the excuse of a shift change. The lights in the room suddenly went out when Sol cut the main power system, plunging the entire floor into darkness, and Holt understood at once that the attack had begun. He pulled Quinn behind the door and drew the gun he always carried with him, but the wound in her shoulder meant Quinn was no longer in the same condition she had been that night at the harbor. Every movement sent pain cutting down to the bone, and this time the situation was different. They were no longer the ones taking action. They were prey being hunted inside their own den. Careful footsteps sounded in the dark hallway outside, and when the door was kicked open, Holt fired first, but he was overwhelmed by their numbers, forcing him and Quinn to retreat deeper inside, moving through dark rooms as Quinn, who had already memorized the entire layout of the house from the earliest days when she had treated every hallway like a scene to be studied, guided him along a little-known service corridor so they wouldn't be driven into a dead end. Though her shoulder hurt and blood had begun seeping through the bandage again, Quinn still kept a cold clarity. She signaled for Holt to work with her, using the darkness and her knowledge of the terrain to turn their weakness into an advantage. And when two of Sol's men rushed in from different directions, she had already calculated their movement from the sound of their footsteps and the layout of the room, warning Holt in time for him to bring one man down, while she used her own wounded body to lock the other man's arm in place and take his weapon with a dangerous hold. Only someone properly trained would know. The struggle was forced back toward Holt's office, where Sol Reyes finally revealed himself, no longer wearing the mask of calm loyalty, but showing the cold face of a man who had decided to gamble everything. He aimed his gun at Holt and spat out bitter words, saying everything should have been clean. If not for the interference of a servant girl, no one should ever have bothered to notice. In the moment his attention and the barrel of his gun were fixed on Holt, Quinn had quietly moved in from a blind corner. Ignoring the searing pain in her shoulder, she used her good arm to violently shove a heavy office chair into Sol, throwing his aim off balance at the exact second he pulled the trigger, sending the bullet into the wall. Then she and Holt brought him crashing to the floor, pinning him down while Holt kicked the gun far away. This time Holt didn't kill him on the spot, though the rage inside him was strong enough to do it, because he understood that a living Sol Reyes could still reveal the entire network behind him, could still lead Holt to the real person who had hired him. So he ordered Sol tied up tightly and summoned the remaining loyal guards to subdue Sol's men, who had begun to fall into confusion without their leader. When everything settled and the lights were restored, Quinn leaned against the wall in exhaustion, her wound bleeding through again. But her eyes still followed Holt, and he stepped toward her to support her, this time unable to hide the shock and aching tenderness in his face, as he realized that this woman, wounded and not yet healed, had once again used her lethal instincts and risked her life to protect him from death, and that the debt he owed her had now become so deep that no words could ever fully describe it. After being subdued and confronted with the entire chain of evidence Quinn had gathered, Sol Reyes understood that he had no way out, and in exchange for a little mercy, he began confessing everything in an emergency meeting. Holt called with the most essential and trusted members of the family, a sealed room where every truth hidden for so long was finally exposed beneath the lights. He admitted that he had been bought off to act as an insider, that Garrett was only a pawn being used, a man buried so deeply in gambling debts that he had become desperate, lured by the promise that if he helped transfer control of the harbor district, all his debts would be erased, without ever knowing that the ending planned for Holt wasn't a business deal, but a death. But what made the entire room fall still and made Quinn's heart seem to stop as she sat there silently watching, was the name Saul gave when asked who had been behind everything, who had paid him, and pulled the strings of the whole conspiracy. It was Bishop Vance, the kingpin of an underworld force that had long stood against the Brennan family, a man who had coveted the North Harbor district for years so he could expand his dark empire. That name struck Quinn like a bolt of lightning, because it wasn't only a name she had once glimpsed in a file. It was the name bound to the nightmare that had destroyed her life 4 years earlier. And when Holt had the old materials related to Vance shown, so everyone in the room could understand their enemy, Quinn was stunned to realize from those images and records that the criminal network led by Bishop Vance was the very organization behind the hostage kidnapping years ago, the fateful night her sister had fallen. The whole world seemed to collapse and spin around Quinn in that moment, as she understood that fate had brought her to this house not by chance, that the man who had stolen her sister from her and driven her into 4 years of self-punishing silence was the very man now trying once again to kill the man she had just risked her life to save, and that her life, after all those years when she thought she had escaped the past, had in truth been quietly leading her back to face the very ghost she feared most. Holt, noticing the shock on Quinn's face, quietly came to her side, and when she wrote to him about the horrifying connection between Bishop Vance and her sister's death, his eyes darkened with the understanding that this war was no longer only a matter of survival for his family, but also a matter of reclaiming justice for the woman who had sacrificed herself for him. In that meeting, Garrett's fate was brought up, and many family members demanded that he be punished without mercy, according to the brutal rules of the underworld. But Holt, standing before that choice, remembered the story of his own father, the man who had died because of betrayal from within the house, and remembered the endless cycle of revenge into which his world always dragged people. He looked at Garrett, who was now trembling and confessing through tears that he had never wanted anyone to die, that he was only a weak man driven to the edge by the terror of debt and used by Vance. And in that version of Garrett, Holt saw not a monster, but a man who had collapsed beneath the weight of his own weakness. And then, to the astonishment of the entire room, Holt declared that he wouldn't kill Garrett, that he was too tired of the bloody cycle his father had once fallen victim to, that Garrett would be stripped of all power and permanently exiled from the family, forced to live the rest of his life with his own cowardice. But Holt would not stain his hands with the blood of someone from his own bloodline again. And in that decision, the man once known for his cold cruelty quietly chose a path completely different from the one the underworld, and even his own father, had once walked. With Sol Reyes's confession and all the evidence Quinn had patiently gathered from the earliest days, Holt stood before a turning point. He could use the power and violence of the underworld to destroy Bishop Vance with his own hands, the way his father and the generations before him had always done, or he could choose a different path. And after the night he had watched Quinn place her life between him and death twice, he decided it was time to break that bloody cycle forever. Instead of rushing into a blood-soaked purge, Holt quietly contacted Detective Frank Halloran, a seasoned investigator he knew had been silently tracking Vance's network for many years, but had always lacked the final piece needed to close the case, and he handed him all the evidence about the plot to seize control of the harbor district, the ambush at the harbor, and the leads connecting Vance to the smuggling and kidnapping ring that had been spreading terror for so long. Quinn played a crucial role in fitting those pieces of evidence into a complete picture, and when Halloran asked whether she was willing to provide testimony about what she knew concerning Vance, she faced a choice of her own, between using this chance to take revenge with her own hands in the way of the underworld for her sister's death, or placing her trust in justice and letting the law punish the man who had done it. Standing before the ghost that had haunted her for 4 years, Quinn realized that if she let hatred guide her and fell into the blind spiral of revenge, she would be no different from the very people who had destroyed her life, and that the best way to honor her sister wasn't to add another death, but to close down the network that had caused so much pain to so many other families. So she chose to sit down and give her full testimony calmly and clearly, turning her private grief into the final piece that allowed justice to be carried out. Thanks to that solid evidence, Detective Halloran and law enforcement had enough grounds to launch a large-scale sweep, and Bishop Vance, the man who had spent years far too confident in his own untouchability, was finally arrested, along with the key links in his network. The underground empire he had labored so long to build collapsed not under the gunfire of an enemy in the shadows, but under the light of the law and evidence that couldn't be denied. When Quinn heard that Vance had been led away in handcuffs, She stood silently by the window for a very long time, and for the first time in 4 years, she felt part of the weight pressing on her chest lift away, not because she had taken revenge, but because she had done what was right, because her sister could finally rest now that the man responsible was paying the price in the way he should have paid long ago. As for Holt, he began making changes he once would never have dared to imagine. Step by step, he withdrew from the darkest operations of the underworld and redirected the harbor business onto a legal path because he understood that those very shadows had fed betrayal and bloodshed through generations of his family. And he no longer wanted to live a life where every morning he woke up having to suspect everyone around him. And among the first things he did as a man trying to change, Holt quietly paid off the entire enormous hospital bill for Quinn's mother and moved her to the best treatment facility money could provide, not as a repayment of a debt, but as an act born from genuine gratitude and from something deeper that he was slowly learning how to admit. When Quinn found out, she came to him with tears shining in her eyes, needing no written words at all, because her gaze had already spoken everything her heart wanted to say. A few weeks later, when Quinn's wound had gradually healed and the last disturbances had finally settled, Holt took her out to the North Harbor District late one afternoon, a place that was no longer a symbol of dark dealings, but was slowly putting on the new face of a harbor operating through legitimate business. And the two of them stood quietly beside each other, watching the sunset fall across the water, staining the whole sky and the waves in a warm orange gold. A scene so peaceful, it was almost hard to believe after everything they had been through together. Holt stood there for a long while in silence, then finally turned to her and asked the question that had been aching in his heart all this time. Why that night at the harbor, when she could have kept driving and saved herself, she had turned back and thrown her own body in front of the bullet meant for him, a man who, to her at the time, was nothing more than a cold employer who had hired her for a cruel reason. Quinn looked at him for a long time. Then instead of reaching for the familiar whiteboard the way she had done through all those months, she drew in a deep breath, and with all the courage she had found again, she spoke. Her voice was hoarse and still trembling because it hadn't been used for so long, but every word came out so clearly and sincerely that Holt held his breath as he listened. She said she had turned back because he was the first person after all those years who had looked at her as a real human being and not as a worthless silence. That while the whole world saw only a mute woman who wasn't worth hearing, he had been the only one willing to bend down, pick up the words she had written, and believe that they mattered. She said the dignity he had given back to her, the feeling of being seen as a whole human being, had awakened the person inside her whom she had believed had died with her sister 4 years ago, and that when she saw him in danger, she understood that she couldn't lose one more person who had treated her with respect, even if saving him meant paying with her own life. Holt listened to those words with reddened eyes, and he gently reached out to take her hand, saying that she was the one who had saved him, not from the 12 gunmen at the harbor, but from the ruthless and lonely man he had become after so many years of living in suspicion and hatred, that she had taught him true strength didn't lie in making others fear you, but in daring to trust and cherish another person, and that he wanted to keep walking this new path with her, a path of light instead of darkness. And Quinn, for the first time in many years, smiled a full smile and nodded softly, letting her hand be warmed in his beneath the fading sunset. The story of Quinn and Holt did not close with gunfire or bloodshed, but with understanding and a love that healed the deepest wounds in the souls of two people who had seemed to have lost everything. And perhaps the greatest lesson this story leaves for each of us is that a person's dignity should never be measured by whether that person can raise a voice aloud, nor by status, wealth, or appearance, because sometimes the people who are most underestimated, most forgotten, are the ones who carry within them the most extraordinary strength and courage. And a kind word, a respectful look given to someone vulnerable, can sometimes save an entire life. May each of us, after hearing this story, learn how to pause and truly see the people around us, listen even to the voices that cannot be spoken aloud, and offer respect to everyone, whoever they are and whatever circumstances they are living in, because kindness and sincere regard are the light that can drive away the darkest shadows in life. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video with your loved ones, so we can listen together to many meaningful and captivating stories every day. And we would truly love to know how you feel about this story, whether it reminded you of something in your own life, So please leave a few lines in the comments, sharing the feelings from deep within your heart, because every story you tell may also become a source of encouragement for someone else quietly listening. Thank you for spending your time following along until the very last moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.